My granddaughter Lily was sitting on my lap at Sunday dinner when she tugged on my sleeve and whispered something that changed my life. "Grandpa, why does Miss Vivian have a phone with a different name?" I looked down at her, 8 years old, pigtails, missing her 2 front teeth. She had no reason to lie about anything. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I saw it in her purse when she was looking for her lipstick. The phone lit up and it said Victoria on the screen, but her name is Vivian, right?" I glanced across the table at my fiancée, Vivian Marchand, the woman I'd been dating for 14 months, engaged to for 8, the woman who was supposed to become my 3rd wife in 6 weeks. She was laughing at something my son Marcus had said, her hand resting elegantly on her champagne glass, completely at ease. Victoria, not Vivian. "I'm sure it was nothing, Peanut," I said, kissing the top of Lily's head. "Maybe you saw it wrong." But I didn't believe that. And somewhere deep in my gut, something that had been sleeping for a long time woke up. That night, after everyone had gone home and Vivian was asleep in my bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind kept circling back to Lily's words. A phone with a different name. Why would anyone have that? A work phone, maybe? But Vivian was an interior designer, freelance, she said. She didn't need a secret phone for work. I thought about all the small things I'd dismissed over the past year, the way she never talked about her childhood in specifics, the way she changed the subject whenever I asked about her late husband Richard, the way her stories sometimes had tiny inconsistencies, a detail that shifted between tellings. I chalked it up to grief, to the way memory works. Now I wasn't so sure. What I found when I started digging into Victoria Marsh would eventually save my life. But in that moment, lying next to my sleeping fiancé, I had no idea she had already killed before, and I was next on her list. Before I get into what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who they claimed to be? If you have, or if you're worried about someone in your life right now, hit that subscribe button. Because at John Vengeance, we believe that love shouldn't make you blind, and getting a second chance at happiness shouldn't cost you everything you've built. Now let me tell you how a 56-year-old restaurant owner from Louisiana ended up engaged to a woman who'd already gotten away with murder once. My name is Hank Delacroix. I was born in Beaumont, Texas in 1968, right across the border from Louisiana. My daddy worked the oil refineries, and my mama waitressed at a diner until her feet gave out. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. I learned early that if you wanted something in this life, you worked for it. Nobody was going to hand you anything.
I fell in love with cooking when I was 12 years old. My grandmother, Mamère we called her, lived in Lake Charles, and every summer I'd spend 2 weeks at her house, learning how to make gumbo, jambalaya, étouffée, all the Cajun classics. She taught me that food was love, that feeding people was the most honest work there was, that a good roux could fix almost anything. After high school, I didn't go to college, couldn't afford it, and honestly, I wasn't built for sitting in classrooms. I worked construction for a few years, saved every penny, and in 1995, when I was 27 years old, I bought a used food truck and started selling po' boys and boudin at job sites around Beaumont. That food truck became a restaurant. That restaurant became 2, then 3, then 7. Delacroix's Cajun Kitchen. I painted that name on my first storefront myself, same way I painted it on the side of that old truck. 28 years later, I've got 7 locations across Louisiana and East Texas. I own the land under 5 of them outright. The business is worth close to $2 million, and my retirement accounts add another $600,000 on top of that. I did all right. Not rich, but comfortable. Still drive a 10-year-old F-150, still wear boots to work, still make the roux myself when I visit the original location in Lake Charles. But the thing I was most proud of wasn't the money or the restaurants. It was my family. I should have listened to Curtis the first time he pulled me aside. What he'd seen at Deborah's funeral, I dismissed it as nothing. I was so wrong. Lorraine was my first wife, high school sweetheart from Beaumont. We got married in 1989, both of us barely 21, too young and too in love to know any better. She was the one who believed in me when nobody else did. She worked double shifts at a grocery store so I could save for that food truck. She handed out flyers. She kept the books when we couldn't afford an accountant. We had one son together, Marcus, born in 1992, the center of our universe. Lorraine got diagnosed with breast cancer in 2003. She fought for 14 months. I held her hand the day she died in a hospice room that smelled like antiseptic and flowers, and I promised her I'd take care of our boy. She was 41 years old. I didn't date for 5 years after that. Couldn't. Every woman I met I compared to Lorraine, and nobody measured up. I threw myself into the business, opened 2 more locations, tried to fill the emptiness with work. Then I met Deborah. She was a widow herself. Husband had died of a heart attack 3 years before we met. We found each other at a grief support group at our church. She understood what it meant to love someone and lose them. She didn't try to replace Lorraine. She just made room for herself alongside the memory.
We got married in 2009. She moved into my house in Lake Charles, helped me raise Marcus through his last years of high school, became the grandmother figure he'd been missing. She was patient and kind and funny in a quiet way that snuck up on you. Deborah had a stroke in 2019. It happened on a Tuesday morning. She was making coffee, and then she was on the floor. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. 2 wives, both dead before I turned 60. Stop. I need to tell you what it's like to bury 2 wives before you're 50. Because if you don't understand that loneliness, you won't understand how a woman like Vivian got so deep under my skin. It's not just the grief. The grief is terrible, don't get me wrong. It's waking up every morning and reaching for someone who isn't there. It's cooking dinner for 2 out of habit and then sitting alone at a table set for 1. It's going to bed in a house so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. But there's something else, something worse. It's the fear that you'll never have that connection again, that you've used up your allotment of love and now you're just waiting to die alone. It's the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there's one more chance, one more person who could make the silence bearable. That's the mindset I was in when I met Vivian Marchand. It was October 2022, about 3 years after Deborah passed. The Lake Charles Food Bank was having their annual charity gala. I'd been a major donor for years, ever since Katrina showed me how fast people could go from comfortable to hungry. I was standing by the buffet, making small talk with people I half knew, counting the minutes until I could politely leave. And then she appeared. Tall, elegant, dark hair pinned up, showing off a neck like a swan. She was wearing a deep green dress that matched her eyes, and she moved through the crowd like she belonged at parties far fancier than this one. She introduced herself as Vivian Marchand. Recently widowed, she said. Her husband Richard had been a dentist in Baton Rouge. Heart attack 3 years ago. She was relocating to Lake Charles for a fresh start. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about my restaurants with what seemed like genuine interest. She laughed at my jokes. She touched my arm when she spoke. And when I mentioned Lorraine and Deborah, she didn't flinch or change the subject. She leaned in closer and said, "Tell me about them. I want to know the women who were lucky enough to love you." By the end of the night, I had her phone number. By the end of the month, we were dating. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly she played it. She didn't push too fast. She was patient, attentive, interested in my world. She volunteered at the same food bank. She started attending my church. She made friends with my friends, charmed my employees, asked about Marcus and Lily with what seemed like genuine warmth. 6 months in, she moved into my house. 8 months after that, I proposed. I bought a ring that cost more than my first food truck. I got down on one knee in the same restaurant where Lorraine and I had our first date, now the flagship of my little empire. Vivian cried. She said yes. We set a date for June. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, I'd been given one more chance. Then Lily whispered in my ear. The morning after that Sunday dinner, Vivian left early for a client meeting in Baton Rouge. She kissed my cheek, told me she'd be back by dinner, and drove off in the Lexus I'd bought her 6 months ago. The moment her car was out of sight, I walked back into the kitchen. Her purse was on the counter. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. I'd never gone through a woman's purse in my life. It felt wrong, invasive, the kind of thing a jealous, controlling man would do. But my granddaughter had no reason to lie, and the question wouldn't leave me alone. Why would Vivian have a phone with a different name? I opened a purse. Under the makeup bag and the wallet and the hand sanitizer, there was a second phone, a cheap prepaid thing, the kind you buy at a gas station. I pressed the power button and the screen lit up. The name on the lock screen said V. Marsh, Victoria Marsh, not Vivian Marchand. My hands were shaking as I swiped through the notifications. They were text messages from a number saved only as J. The most recent one, from 2 days ago. Clock is ticking, Vicky. 60 days. Don't make me come find you. The one before that. You think your restaurant man is going to protect you? I made you. I can unmake you. And the one before that. Remember Costa Rica. Remember what we did. 500K or everyone finds out. I took photos of the screen. Every message, every notification, every detail. Then I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, zipped the purse closed, and sat down at my kitchen table. My fiancée was being blackmailed by someone who knew her by a different name for something that happened in Costa Rica, something worth $500,000 to keep quiet. The private investigator's report was 23 pages long, but it was page 19 that made me put down my coffee and sit in absolute silence for 10 minutes. What I read there changed everything. I didn't confront Vivian. That was my first instinct, to wait until she came home and demand answers. But something told me that would be a mistake. If she was dangerous, I didn't want her to know I was suspicious. If she was being threatened, I needed to understand by whom and why before I made any moves. So I did what any businessman would do when facing a problem he didn't understand. I hired an expert. The private investigator's name was Renee Boudreau, former New Orleans PB, 20 years as a detective before going private. She specialized in background checks, fraud investigation, and what she called domestic situation assessment. She came highly recommended by my attorney.
I met her at a coffee shop in Sulphur, far from anywhere Vivian might see me. I told her everything, the phone, the messages, the name Victoria Marsh, my suspicions. Renee didn't react, just wrote in her notepad and asked follow-up questions in a flat, professional voice. "I'll need 2 weeks," she said. "Full background on Vivian Marchand and Victoria Marsh, financial records, property records, any criminal history. I'll also see what I can find on this J person and the Costa Rica connection." "And if you find something bad?" She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Then we'll figure out your next move together. But, Mr. Delacroix, if this woman is who I think she might be, you need to be very careful. Don't let her know you're looking. Don't change your behavior. Act exactly the same as you've been acting." "You think I'm in danger?" "I think you're a wealthy widower who got engaged to a woman with a secret identity and mysterious blackmailers. In my experience, that combination rarely ends well." 2 weeks later, Renee called me to her office. The report was 23 pages, single-spaced, detailed. The first 18 pages were about Vivian Marchand, or rather, about the absence of Vivian Marchand. There was no record of anyone named Vivian Claire Marchand being born in New Orleans or anywhere else in Louisiana. There was no marriage license for a Vivian Marchand and a Richard Marchand. There was no death certificate for a dentist named Richard Marchand anywhere in the state. The Social Security number Vivian used had been issued in 2015, only 8 years ago, to a Vivian M. Marchand with an address in Baton Rouge that turned out to be a P.O. box. Before 2015, Vivian Marchand didn't exist. But Victoria Lynn Marsh did. Page 19 was where Renee laid it all out. Victoria Lynn Marsh was born in Shreveport in 1979, high school graduate, no college, worked as a cocktail waitress, a dental hygienist, a real estate agent, whatever paid the bills. In 2008, she was living with a man named Jerome Bellamy in New Orleans. In 2013, Jerome Bellamy died, boating accident on Lake Pontchartrain. His body was never recovered. Victoria Marsh was the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy, $400,000. She collected the money, she disappeared, and Jerome Bellamy was never seen again. Until now. "The blackmailer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jay, that's Jerome." Renee nodded. "That's my read. He's alive. The death was faked for the insurance money. They split it and went their separate ways. Him to Costa Rica, her to a series of new identities and new marks." "Marks?" "Mr. Delacroix, this isn't the first time Victoria Marsh has done this. After the insurance payout, she resurfaced in Baton Rouge under a different name, Valerie Martin.
She was engaged to a wealthy widower named George Fontenot. He owned a chain of dry cleaners, substantial real estate holdings. Sound familiar?
My stomach dropped. What happened to him? He died. Accidental prescription overdose, 2 months before the wedding. His daughter always suspected foul play, but there was never enough evidence to prove anything. Valerie Martin disappeared the day after the funeral. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The woman sleeping in my bed, wearing my ring, calling me sweetheart, she was a black widow. She targeted wealthy widowers, got engaged, and then something happened before the wedding. Something fatal, something that looked like an accident. And now Jerome was back, demanding money she didn't have, money she needed to get from me. There's one more thing, Renee said. She slid a photograph across the desk. I found this in old property management records from an apartment complex in New Orleans. It's a copy of Victoria Marsh's signature on a lease from 2010. She slid another photograph. And this is a document you gave me, the draft deed Vivian prepared, adding her name to your property. Even I could see it. The handwriting was identical. I've had a certified handwriting analyst confirm it, Renee said. These were written by the same person. Victoria Marsh and Vivian Marchand are the same woman. It's not speculation anymore. It's fact. I sat there in that office, holding the evidence that my fiancé was a con artist and possibly a murderer. And I felt something I hadn't felt since Deborah died. I felt absolutely alone. I reached into the hidden compartment under the spare tire. My fingers touched something cold, plastic. When I pulled it out and read the label, I understood exactly who I was dealing with and what she was capable of. 3 days after that meeting with Renee, I did something I'm not proud of. Vivian said she had a lunch meeting with a potential client. The moment she left, I went to the garage. The Lexus she drove, the one I'd bought for her, was parked in its usual spot. She'd taken my truck instead, said the Lexus was making a funny noise. I'd been thinking about that car for days. If Vivian was planning something, if she had an exit strategy, there might be evidence in the vehicle. A go bag, money, documents. I started with the trunk. Nothing unusual. Spare tire, jack, emergency kit. But when I lifted the floor mat to check the spare tire well, I noticed something. The compartment was deeper than it should have been. Someone had modified it. I reached in and felt around the edges. My fingers found a latch. The hidden compartment popped open. Inside, I found 3 things. First, $15,000 in cash, bundled in hundreds. Second, a complete set of identity documents, Louisiana driver's license, U.S. passport, 2 credit cards, all in the name of Valerie Martin. Third, a prescription bottle, oxycodone, 30 tablets, mostly full. The name on the bottle was George Fontenot. I sat back on my heels in that garage, holding a dead man's pills, and I understood everything.
Victoria Marsh, Valerie Martin, Vivian Marchand. 3 names, 1 woman. She'd killed George Fontenot with his own medication, made it look like an accidental overdose, and kept the bottle as, what? A trophy? Insurance? Evidence to hold over Jerome if he ever turned on her? And now she was engaged to me, living in my house, sleeping in my bed, waiting for the right moment to collect another insurance payout. I photographed everything, then I put it all back exactly as I'd found it. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I had proof, and I knew exactly who I needed to talk to next. Have you ever had your own son look at you like you're a stranger? Like you've lost your mind? Because when Marcus walked into my house that day, sent by her, I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart. But what I showed him next changed everything between us forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before Marcus showed up, before Vivian's scheme started falling apart, I needed to talk to Curtis. Curtis Thibodeau owns Thibodeau Family Funeral Home, the oldest funeral parlor in Lake Charles. He handled the services for both Lorraine and Deborah. He'd known me since high school. We weren't close friends back then, but we'd become closer over the years, bound together by the kind of shared history that only comes from living in the same small city your whole life. Curtis had been the one who helped me pick out Deborah's casket. He'd sat with me in his office while I sobbed like a child, and he hadn't said a word, just handed me tissues and let me grieve. That's the kind of man he was.
I called him on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if I could come by. Something in my voice must have told him this wasn't a social call, because he cleared his schedule and met me in his private office, away from the viewing rooms in the grieving families. "Hank, you look like hell," he said, closing the door behind us. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The phone with the different name, the messages from Jerome, Renee's investigation, the hidden compartment in the car, the prescription bottle with George Fontenot's name on it. Curtis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. I knew something was wrong with that woman. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Hank, I saw her at Deborah's funeral. I didn't think much of it at the time. There were a lot of people there, and I was focused on you in the service. But she was in the back, near the door, watching, not crying, not praying, just watching." Vivian was at Deborah's funeral? She wasn't calling herself Vivian then. I don't know what name she was using, but when you introduced her to me a year later as your new girlfriend, I recognized her face. I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe it was just a coincidence, but it bothered me. He paused, rubbing his jaw.
Then, about 6 months ago, I saw her again, at another funeral. A widower in Sulphur, guy named Harold Robichaux, owned a bunch of commercial property. His wife died of cancer, and less than a year later, he was engaged to some woman nobody knew. I did the service, and there she was, in the back row, watching. Same woman, your fiancée. What happened to Harold? Curtis shook his head slowly. He's still alive as far as I know. Maybe she didn't get her hooks deep enough. Maybe something spooked her. But Hank, she's hunting. That's what this is. She goes to funerals, finds wealthy widowers, and moves in. I felt sick. The gala where we met, the grief support group references, the way she seemed to know exactly how to comfort a mourning man, it wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. She'd probably researched me, probably knew about my restaurants, my properties, my dead wives, before she ever introduced herself. "There's something else," Curtis said. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I've got a colleague in Baton Rouge, another funeral director. About 2 years ago, he handled a service for a man named George Fontenot, wealthy, widowed, engaged to a woman who disappeared right after the burial." George Fontenot. I know that name. I called my colleague when you started dating Vivian, just to check. He remembered the fiancée. Her name was Valerie Martin. He said George's daughter always believed the woman killed him, but the police ruled it an accident. "Can you put me in touch with the daughter?" Curtis nodded. "I already reached out. Her name is Marguerite Fontenot. She's willing to talk. More than willing, actually. She's been waiting 8 years for someone to believe her." I met Marguerite at a coffee shop in Lafayette, halfway between Lake Charles and Baton Rouge. She was in her 40s, thin and tense, with the look of someone who'd spent too many years carrying a weight nobody else could see. She brought photographs. Her father George at his birthday party 3 months before he died. A picture of him with his fiancée Valerie at a restaurant. Valerie's face turned slightly away from the camera but recognizable. It was Vivian. Same cheekbones, same elegant neck, same cold eyes behind the warm smile. "She killed him," Marguerite said flatly. "I know she did. He was healthy. He wasn't taking oxycodone. He'd never had a prescription for it in his life. But the autopsy found it in his system, enough to kill him, and there was a bottle in his medicine cabinet with his name on it. A bottle that was never there before." "Exactly. The police said he must have gotten it from a friend, used it for back pain without telling anyone. They said old men do things like that. But my daddy wasn't some careless old man. He was sharp as a tack. He would never take pills without knowing what they were." She leaned across the table, her eyes burning.
And then Valerie disappeared. The day after the funeral. Didn't even stay for the reading of the will. Just vanished. Left behind everything he'd bought her. Clothes, jewelry, a car. Like she was running from something. Or like she'd already gotten what she came for. "The insurance," Marguerite said bitterly. Daddy had changed his life insurance 2 months before he died, made Valerie the beneficiary. $750,000. She collected every penny. I showed Marguerite the photograph I'd taken of the prescription bottle I found in Vivian's car. Her father's name, his address, the same medication that had killed him. She started crying. "That's his," she whispered. "That's the bottle. She kept it. All these years. She kept the thing that killed my father." "She's engaged to me now," I said, "and I think she's planning to do the same thing." Marguerite wiped her eyes and grabbed my hand. "Then stop her, whatever you have to do. Stop her and make her pay for what she did to my daddy." "I will, but I need your help."
That's when I laid out my plan. The engagement party was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Vivian had been pushing for it, insisting we needed to celebrate with friends and family before the wedding. She wanted it at my house, she said, more intimate, more personal. I agreed, but not for the reasons she thought. I was going to expose her in front of everyone. I was going to play the recordings from her burner phone. I was going to present the evidence, the identity documents, the prescription bottle, the witness testimony, and I was going to have police waiting outside to arrest her the moment she tried to run. But I needed Marguerite to be there, a living witness, the daughter of a man Vivian had killed, someone who could look her in the eye and demand justice. Marguerite agreed without hesitation. I've been waiting 8 years for this moment, she said. I'll be there. I also reached out to the Lake Charles Police Department, not the regular cops. I asked to speak with their financial crimes unit. I explained the situation, showed them Renee's investigation, and laid out everything I knew. They were skeptical at first, a grieving fiancé making wild accusations about his bride-to-be. I'd seen that look before, from people who assumed I was just a paranoid old man. But when I showed them the prescription bottle with George Fontenot's name on it, their attitude changed. We'll need to coordinate with Baton Rouge, the detective said. If she's wanted in connection with a death there, this becomes a multi-jurisdictional case. Whatever it takes, just be ready on the night of the party. They agreed to have plainclothes officers in the area, ready to move if Vivian tried to run. Everything was falling into place, but Vivian wasn't stupid. She could sense something had shifted.
I'd been careful to act the same as always, affectionate, trusting, maybe a little distracted by work. But Vivian was a predator, and predators have instincts. She started watching me more closely, asking more questions, checking my phone when she thought I wasn't looking. And then she made her move. It started with a phone call. I was at the restaurant, going over inventory with my general manager, when my phone buzzed. It was Marcus, my son, calling from Houston. "Dad, we need to talk." Something in his voice made my chest tighten. "What's wrong?" "Vivian called me. She's worried about you." Vivian, calling my son behind my back. What did she say? She said you've been acting strange, paranoid. She said you accused her of stealing from you, even though she hasn't touched your money. She said, he paused. She said you might have early signs of dementia. I closed my eyes. Of course, that was her play. If she couldn't manipulate me, she'd manipulate my son. If she couldn't get me to sign over my assets voluntarily, she'd have me declared incompetent and take control that way. "Marcus, I don't have dementia." "That's what someone with dementia would say, Dad." His voice was frustrated, worried. "Vivian thinks you should see a specialist. She's already found a neurologist in New Orleans who can do a full evaluation." "And if the neurologist says I'm fine?" "Then we'll all relax. But Dad, you're 56 years old. You've had 2 major losses. It wouldn't be crazy for your brain to start, I don't know, struggling." Struggling. That's what my own son thought. That I was struggling. That I was losing my mind. Because a woman he'd known for barely a year had told him so. "I'll take the evaluation," I said calmly. "Schedule it whenever you want." "Really?" "Really. But Marcus, I need you to trust me. Just for a few more weeks. Can you do that?" There was a long pause. "I'll try, Dad. But Vivian really seems worried about you. She cares about you." I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long moment. She was good. I had to give her that. She was very, very good. The neurological evaluation happened a week later. I drove to New Orleans, sat in a sterile office, and answered questions for 3 hours. Memory tests, cognitive assessments, physical examinations, the works. The doctor was a woman named Dr. Patel, serious and thorough. At the end of the evaluation, she sat me down in her office and delivered her verdict. "Mr. Delacroix, I find no evidence of cognitive impairment. Your memory is excellent for a man your age. Your reasoning skills are intact. Your neurological function is completely normal. So I don't have dementia. You don't have dementia. You don't have early-stage Alzheimer's. You don't have any condition that would affect your mental competency." She paused. "May I ask why you were referred for this evaluation? Your son mentioned concerns from your fiancée."
My fiancée is trying to have me declare incompetent so she can take control of my assets, I said flatly. She's a con artist who's done this before. She may have killed her last target. Dr. Patel's eyebrows rose, but she didn't argue. In that case, I'll make sure my report is extremely thorough, and I'll document this conversation. If there's ever a legal proceeding, you'll have medical evidence that you were fully competent. Thank you, doctor. I left that office with a clean bill of mental health and a paper trail proving Vivian's accusations were baseless. But she wasn't done. When the dementia angle failed, she escalated. 3 days later, Marcus showed up at my house unannounced. He looked terrible, exhausted, conflicted, angry. Vivian must have been working on him hard since the evaluation came back clean. Dad, we need to talk. I let him in. Vivian wasn't home. She was at her design studio, which I now knew was just a rented mailbox she used to maintain her cover. What's going on, son? Vivian called me again. She's scared, Dad. She says you've been threatening her, going through her things, making accusations. She says she doesn't feel safe in this house anymore. I felt the old anger rising, but I kept my voice calm. Marcus, I want to show you something. Come with me. I led him to my home office. For the past 2 weeks, I'd been installing cameras throughout the house. Small, hidden, the kind Vivian would never notice. I'd captured hours of footage. What is this? Marcus asked as I pulled up the recordings on my laptop. Just watch. I showed him the footage of Vivian on her burner phone, talking to Jerome. The old man won't last much longer. Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. Then you'll get your money, and we'll be done. Marcus's face went pale. I showed him the footage of Vivian photographing my financial documents at 2 a.m. when she thought I was asleep. I showed him the footage of her practicing lies in front of my hallway mirror. I never met anyone named George. I've always lived in New Orleans. Richard died of a heart attack. Rehearsing answers to questions nobody had asked yet. And then I showed him the prescription bottle. This was hidden in a secret compartment in her car, I said, handing it to him. The man whose name is on this bottle is dead. He was engaged to a woman matching Vivian's description. He died of an overdose of this exact medication. His daughter believes he was murdered. Marcus stared at the bottle. His hands were shaking. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. She seemed so. I know. She's good at this. She's had practice. What do we do? The engagement party is in 4 days. I need you there. I need you to act normal, act like nothing's changed. And when the moment comes, I need you to help me make sure she can't run. Marcus met my eyes. The doubt and suspicion were gone. In their place was the same determination I felt in my own heart.
I'll be there, Dad. Whatever you need. If you're still here following this story, hit the like button so more people can see it. And stay with me, because what happened at that engagement party, when Vivian finally realized she'd picked the wrong mark, that's the part I've been waiting to tell you. 40 people in my living room. Friends, family, employees. Vivian smiling in her white dress, champagne glass in hand, confident she'd won. She had no idea I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. The night of the engagement party was warm and clear, the kind of Louisiana evening that makes you remember why you live in the South despite the humidity. I'd had the house clean top to bottom. Caterers were setting up in the kitchen. A string quartet was playing soft jazz on the back porch. Vivian was in our bedroom, getting ready. She'd bought a new dress for the occasion. White silk, sleeveless, elegant. She looked like a bride already. She looked happy. I stood in my home office, door locked, going over the plan one more time. Marcus was positioned near the front door. If Vivian tried to run, he'd block her exit. Marguerite Fontenot was already there, sitting quietly in a corner with a glass of wine, waiting for her moment. 2 plainclothes Lake Charles police officers were parked across the street, ready to move on my signal. Renee, my investigator, had provided me with a portable speaker and a tablet loaded with the audio recordings from Vivian's burner phone. In my jacket pocket, I had photographs of every piece of evidence we'd gathered. The identity documents, the handwriting analysis, the prescription bottle, now secured by police as evidence, but photographed in detail. Everything was ready. The woman from Baton Rouge agreed to come. Her father was buried 8 years ago, and she'd spent every day since wondering if she could have saved him. Tonight, she was going to help me do what she never could, expose a killer. Guests arrived steadily for the first hour. My employees from the restaurants, friends from church, neighbors, a few local business owners I'd known for decades.
everyone congratulating me, telling me how happy they were that I'd found love again, how lucky I was to have Vivian. I smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but inside I was counting the minutes. At 8 o'clock, Vivian made her entrance. She descended the staircase like a queen, white dress flowing, diamond earrings catching the light, earrings I bought her for Christmas. She was radiant, she was perfect, and she was a murderer walking free. She worked the room beautifully, kissing cheeks, accepting compliments, her hand always finding its way back to mine. The devoted fiancée, the loving partner, the woman who'd brought happiness back into poor Hank Delacroix's lonely life. At 8:30, she clinked her glass and called for everyone's attention.
I just want to say, she began, her voice honey-sweet, how grateful I am to be standing here tonight. When I lost my husband Richard, I thought my heart would never heal. And then I met this wonderful man, and he showed me that love doesn't have an expiration date. Hank, you've given me a second chance at happiness, and I'll spend the rest of our lives making sure you never regret choosing me. The room applauded. People wiped their eyes. Someone called out, "Kiss her." I kissed her cheek, and then I said, "Actually, I'd like to say something too." Now here's where every dollar I'd spent, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt paid off. Here's where a 56-year-old restaurant owner from Lake Charles showed a con artist that she'd picked the wrong mark. The room fell quiet. Vivian smiled at me, perfectly trusting. "First," I said, "I want to thank all of you for being here. You're my family, my community, the people who've supported me through the hardest moments of my life, burying Lorraine, burying Deborah, building this business from nothing." I paused, looked around the room, met Marcus's eyes, Marguerite's eyes, saw the officers outside through the front window. Which is why I need to tell you the truth. Vivian's smile flickered, just for a second. "Honey, what are you doing?" "There isn't going to be a wedding." The murmur that went through the room was like a wave. Confusion, concern. Vivian's face went pale. "Hank, sweetheart, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I pulled out the tablet and the portable speaker. Vivian Marchand is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Victoria Lynn Marsh. Before that, she went by Valerie Martin. She's a con artist who targets wealthy widowers, gets engaged, and then takes everything they have. "This is insane," Vivian said, her voice rising. "Hank, you need help. You're not well. I've been telling everyone." "I'm perfectly well. I had a full neurological evaluation last week, clean bill of health, documented by a specialist in New Orleans who will testify that I'm fully competent." I pressed play on the tablet. Vivian's voice filled the room, crystal clear. "The old man won't last much longer. Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. Then you'll get your money, and we'll be done." The room went silent. Vivian's face was frozen. "That's you," I said, "talking to your partner, Jerome Bellamy, the man you faked a death for in 2013, the man who's been blackmailing you for $500,000. "I don't know what you're talking about." I played another recording, Vivian's voice again. "I've got copies of all his financial documents, property deeds, retirement accounts, everything. Once I'm on the paperwork, we liquidate and disappear, same as George." Someone in the room gasped. Vivian tried to laugh, but it came out strangled. "This is fabricated. You're making this up. Everyone knows you've been paranoid, Hank. You've been—" George Fontenot, I said, cutting her off. Baton Rouge, 2016. Wealthy widower. Engaged to a woman named Valerie Martin. Died of an accidental overdose 2 months before the wedding. I gestured toward the corner of the room. "His daughter is here tonight. Marguerite, would you like to say something?" Marguerite stood up. She was trembling, but her voice was steady. "You killed my father," she said, looking directly at Vivian. "You gave him oxycodone he never would have taken on his own. You watched him die, and then you disappeared with his money." Vivian's composure cracked. "I've never seen this woman before in my life. I don't know anyone named George." I held up the photograph of the prescription bottle. "This was hidden in your car, in a secret compartment under the spare tire. George Fontenot's name, George Fontenot's address, George Fontenot's medication. The same pills that killed him." The room erupted. People shouting, crying. Someone knocked over a champagne glass. Vivian looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. "This is insane," she said, backing toward the staircase. "You're all insane. I'm leaving." "I don't think so." Marcus stepped in front of the door. "You're not going anywhere." Vivian's mask finally shattered. The elegant, loving fiancée was gone. In her place was something cold, something desperate. "You stupid old man," she hissed. "You think you've won? You think any of this matters?
I'll deny everything. It's your word against mine. Those recordings could be faked. That bottle could have been planted. No jury is going to believe. The front door opened. 2 police officers stepped inside, badges visible. Victoria Lynn Marsh, one of them said. You're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. You'll also be held for questioning in connection with the death of George Fontenot. Vivian lunged for the back door. She didn't get far. An officer I hadn't seen, stationed on the porch, caught her before she made it 3 steps. They handcuffed her in my living room, in front of 40 guests, in her beautiful white dress. As they led her toward the door, she turned and looked at me one last time. You were supposed to be easy, she said, just another lonely old man waiting to die. I looked her right in the eyes. I'm not lonely anymore, and I'm not waiting for anything. They took her away. The door closed behind her, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The weeks after the engagement party were strange, quiet in a way I hadn't expected. The house felt different without Vivian in it. Not emptier, exactly. It had been empty before she arrived, and I'd grown used to that. But there was an absence now that had a different texture. The absence of deception, the absence of danger, the absence of constantly wondering, in the back of my mind, whether the woman I loved was real. She wasn't real. None of it was real. And coming to terms with that took longer than I thought it would.
The legal process moved faster than I expected. Vivian, Victoria, was held without bail after prosecutors presented evidence that she was a flight risk. They found the identity documents in her car, the ones in the name of Valerie Martin. They found evidence of 3 other aliases she'd used over the years, and they found records of wire transfers to an account in Costa Rica traced back to Jerome Bellamy. Jerome was arrested 2 weeks later. The FBI coordinated with Costa Rican authorities, and he was picked up at a beachfront bar in Tamarindo, drinking rum and watching the sunset. He'd been living there for 10 years on the insurance money he and Victoria had stolen, supplementing his income by blackmailing her whenever he needed a cash infusion. When they brought him back to Louisiana, he talked. He talked about everything: the fake death in 2013, the insurance payout, the partnership that had gone sour when Victoria decided she wanted to keep all the profits for herself. He testified that she'd called him after George Fontenot's death, bragging about how easy it had been. She said the old man never saw it coming, Jerome told the court, said she just put the pills in his evening tea. He was dead by morning. With Jerome's testimony, the physical evidence, and Marguerite's identification, the Baton Rouge district attorney reopened the investigation into George Fontenot's death. The charges against Victoria Lynn Marsh were substantial. In Louisiana, first-degree fraud, identity theft, criminal conspiracy, attempted theft of assets exceeding $100,000. In Baton Rouge, second-degree murder in the death of George Fontenot. Her lawyers tried to negotiate. They claimed she was a victim herself, manipulated by Jerome, coerced into the insurance scheme, traumatized by years of abuse. They painted her as a desperate woman making desperate choices. The jury didn't buy it. Victoria was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 18 years for the murder charge, with an additional 4 years for the fraud and identity theft to be served consecutively. 22 years total. She'll be eligible for parole in 15, when she's nearly 60 years old. Jerome Bellamy got 12 years for insurance fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. He'll be 71 when he gets out, assuming he survives prison. When the verdict was read, I was sitting in the back of the courtroom. Marguerite was beside me, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard I thought she might break my fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for finishing what I couldn't." I squeezed back. "Your father can rest now. So can mine." That wasn't quite true, of course. My father had died of a heart attack 20 years ago, and he had nothing to do with any of this, but I understood what she meant. Some debts aren't about blood. They're about justice.
Marguerite and I stayed in touch after the trial. She drove down to Lake Charles a few times, and we had dinner at my flagship restaurant. She told me about her father, what kind of man he was, how much he loved his dry cleaning business, how he'd spent his retirement volunteering at the local library. He sounded like someone I would have liked. She asked about Lorraine and Deborah. I told her about them, their laughter, their patience, the way they'd both believed in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. It felt good to talk about them with someone who understood loss. But eventually, Marguerite went back to her life in Baton Rouge, and I went back to mine in Lake Charles. We text occasionally, send Christmas cards, but we're not close friends, not really. We're just 2 people who shared a terrible experience and came out the other side. The hardest part wasn't the trial or the aftermath with Vivian. The hardest part was Marcus. My son flew in from Houston the day after the engagement party. He stayed for a week, helping me deal with the police, the lawyers, the endless questions.
He was there when I gave my statement. He was there when they searched Vivian's belongings and found even more evidence. Burner phones, forged documents, a journal where she'd kept notes on her projects, as she called them. I was one of 7 names in that journal. 7 wealthy widowers she'd researched, stalked, and considered targeting. I was the one she'd chosen. Marcus read that journal. He saw his father's name circled in red ink, with notes about my restaurants, my properties, my habits, my vulnerabilities. He saw the entry where she'd written, "Grief makes him compliant. Push for quick engagement. Isolate from son if necessary." He closed the journal and didn't speak for a long time. "Dad," he finally said, "I almost helped her. I almost got you declared incompetent. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have trusted you. She was good at what she did, Marcus. She'd been doing it for years. She fooled a lot of people smarter than either of us." He shook his head. "That's not good enough. I'm your son. When you tried to tell me something was wrong, I should have listened. Instead, I listened to her." I didn't have an answer for that, because he was right. He should have listened. He should have trusted his father over a woman he'd known for barely a year. But he didn't, and that failure would sit between us for a long time. Marcus went back to Houston after the week was over. We talk on the phone now, maybe once a month. He sends pictures of Lily sometimes, at school, at soccer practice, growing up faster than I can believe. But the warmth isn't there anymore. The easy affection we used to have is gone, replaced by something careful and polite.
I don't blame him, not really. But I don't know how to fix it either. Some things, once broken, can only be repaired slowly, over years, over decades, and I'm 56 years old. I don't know how many years I have left. The one relationship that stayed intact was the one that mattered most. Lily, my granddaughter, the one who started all of this with her innocent observation about a phone with a different name. She doesn't know the full story, of course. She's too young for that. Marcus and his wife told her that Vivian went away and that the wedding was canceled. Lily accepted it with the easy adaptability of children. She was more interested in showing me her new dinosaur collection than in asking questions about the woman who used to call herself her step-grandmother. We still do Saturday morning pancakes when I visit Houston. We still FaceTime every week so she can tell me about school and her friends and the books she's reading. She still calls me Grandpa in that bright, loving voice that makes everything else in the world seem small. If I hadn't listened to her that night, if I'd dismissed her observation as a child's confusion, I might be dead right now. Vivian might have added another name to her journal, another victim to her list, another insurance payout to her bank account. But I listened, and because I listened, I'm still here. I'm telling you this because I know there are people watching who've been where I was, lonely, desperate for connection, willing to believe the best about someone because the alternative is too painful. You're not stupid, you're not weak, you're human, and there's a way out. 6 months after the trial ended, I made some changes. I sold 3 of my restaurant locations, kept 4, including the flagship in Lake Charles. The general manager I trusted for years took over day-to-day operations completely, and I stepped back into a purely advisory role. I still own the business, still collect the profits, but I'm not there every day anymore. It was time. I'd spent 28 years building Delacroix's Cajun Kitchen from a food truck to a regional chain. That was enough. I'd proven what I needed to prove. Now I wanted to rest. With the proceeds from the sale, I set up 2 scholarship funds. The Lorraine Delacroix Memorial Scholarship for young women pursuing culinary arts. The Deborah Delacroix Memorial Scholarship for widows returning to the workforce. Both administered through the Lake Charles Community College, both fully funded for the next 20 years. It felt right. A way to honor the 2 women who'd believed in me. A way to turn my fortune into something that would help people like I'd once been helped. I also started volunteering. There's an organization called the AARP Fraud Watch Network that educates seniors about scams. Roman scams, phone scams, identity theft schemes. They needed speakers who could share personal experiences, and I had quite a story to tell.
The first time I stood in front of a room full of retirees and told them what Vivian had done to me, I was terrified. Not of public speaking. I'd done plenty of that over the years, at Chamber of Commerce meetings and charity events. I was terrified of the shame, of admitting that I, a successful businessman, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, had been fooled by a woman who pretended to love me. But something unexpected happened. When I finished my story, people didn't laugh. They didn't judge. They thanked me. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "Something like that almost happened to my sister," she said. "A man she met online. He wanted money for a plane ticket to come see her. She sent him $3,000 before we figured out what was happening." A man in the back nodded. "My brother-in-law lost his house to a woman like that. Met her at church, married her in 6 months. She cleaned out his accounts and disappeared." Story after story, person after person. I realized I wasn't alone. This wasn't some rare, shameful thing that only happened to fools. It was an epidemic, targeting the most vulnerable among us, the lonely, the grieving, the desperate for connection. Now I give that talk once a month. Different senior centers, different churches, different community groups. I tell them about the red flags I missed, the questions I should have asked, the way she isolated me from my family and friends. I tell them to trust their instincts, to verify before they trust, to remember that real love doesn't need to rush. Maybe I'll save someone. Maybe someone will hear my story and recognize the patterns in their own life. That would be enough. That would be more than enough.
About 4 months ago, something happened that surprised me. I was at the grocery store, of all places, standing in the produce aisle, trying to remember whether I needed onions. And this woman reached past me for a bunch of green onions, and our hands touched, and she laughed and apologized. Her name was Helen, 62 years old, retired school librarian, widowed for 5 years. Her husband died of Parkinson's after a long decline. She'd moved to Lake Charles recently to be closer to her grandchildren. We talked for 20 minutes in that produce aisle. Then we talked for an hour over coffee at the cafe next door. Then we exchanged numbers, and she texted me that night to say she'd enjoyed meeting me. I almost didn't respond, almost let the fear win. But Curtis had been pushing me to get back out there, and Helen seemed genuine, real, different. We've been on 4 dates now. Dinner, a movie, a walk along the lakefront, a Sunday afternoon at the farmer's market where she introduced me to her daughter and grandchildren. I've been honest with her about what happened with Vivian. I told her the whole story on our second date, figuring it was better to scare her off early than to hide something that big. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "That must have been terrifying," she said, "and humiliating and heartbreaking. It was all of those things. But you survived. You stopped her. You protected yourself and helped other people along the way." She squeezed my hand. "That's not weakness, Hank. That's strength." I don't know where this is going with Helen. It's too early to tell. But for the first time since Vivian was arrested, I feel something other than fear when I think about the future. I feel hope. I adopted a dog 6 weeks after the trial, a rescue from the Lake Charles Animal Shelter, a 7-year-old hound mix with sad eyes and a graying muzzle. They said he'd been surrendered by a family that couldn't care for him anymore. Too old, they said. Nobody wants the old ones. I named him Gumbo. He sleeps at the foot of my bed. He follows me from room to room. He sits beside me on the porch in the evenings while I watch the sunset and drink a beer and think about everything I've lost and everything I still have. Sometimes, late at night, I talk to him about Lorraine and Deborah, about the years we had together, about the things I wish I'd said and the moments I wish I could have back. He doesn't answer, of course. He just rests his head on my knee and looks at me with those sad, wise eyes. It helps, more than I expected. I'm 57 years old now. My birthday was last month. Lily made me a card with dinosaurs on it. "Happy birthday, Grandpa," in purple crayon, with a T-Rex wearing a party hat. I have it framed on my desk. Marcus called to say happy birthday. The conversation was short, polite, surface level. But he called. That's something.
I've learned a few things this past year. Things I wish I'd known earlier, but maybe you can only learn them through experience. I learned that loneliness is dangerous. Not the loneliness itself, but what it makes you willing to accept. When you're desperate for connection, you stop seeing clearly. You ignore the warning signs. You tell yourself that love is supposed to feel like relief, like rescue, when really it's supposed to feel like partnership, like teamwork, like two people building something together, not one person swooping in to save the other. I learned that trust has to be earned, not demanded, not assumed,
not given freely because someone says the right things and shows up at the right moments. Real trust is built over time, through actions, through consistency, through the small moments when no one is watching. Vivian knew exactly what to say, but her actions, if I'd been paying attention, told a different story. I learned that family isn't always right. Marcus was wrong about Vivian. He was wrong about me. His intentions were good. He genuinely worried about his father, but he let an outsider manipulate his concern into a weapon. I don't hate him for it, but I wish he'd trusted me the way I trusted him. And I learned that it's never too late to start over. I'm 57. I've buried 2 wives. I almost became the victim of a con artist and possible murderer. My relationship with my son is strained, my trust in people is damaged, and I'll probably never be as open and optimistic as I was before all this happened. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. I have a dog and a fishing boat and a business that supports my community. I have a granddaughter who loves me, and a new friend in Helen, and a purpose in helping other people avoid the trap I almost fell into. That's more than a lot of people have, and it's enough. Last week I was giving one of my talks at a senior center in Sulphur. Afterward, a man approached me. 74 years old, recently widowed, clearly struggling. "I met someone online," he said quietly, so no one else could hear. "She's beautiful, says she's from the Philippines. She wants to come visit, but she needs money for the visa fees." I looked at him, saw myself a year ago, lonely, hopeful, desperate to believe. "How much has she asked for so far?" He hesitated. $1,200, but this time she says it's the last amount. Once I send this, she can finally come. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Brother, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but that woman doesn't exist, not the way you think she does. And if you send that money, you'll never see it again, and she'll ask for more. There's always more." His eyes filled with tears. "But she said she loves me." "I know, they always do." We talked for an hour. I gave him resources, the FTC, the AARP fraud hotline, local support groups. I gave him my phone number and told him to call anytime.
I don't know if he'll listen. I don't know if I got through to him, but I tried. That's all any of us can do. I was supposed to be easy, just another lonely old man waiting to die. That's what Vivian said to me the night they arrested her. And she was right, in a way. I was lonely. I was vulnerable. I was exactly the kind of mark she'd been hunting for years. But she made one mistake. She underestimated me. She underestimated the granddaughter who noticed a phone with a different name. She underestimated the funeral director who remembered seeing her in the wrong place. She underestimated the investigator who knew how to dig. She underestimated the daughter in Baton Rouge who never stopped believing her father was murdered. And she underestimated a 56-year-old restaurant owner from Louisiana who'd built everything he had from nothing and wasn't about to let anyone take it away. I'm not waiting to die. I'm not waiting for anything. I'm living. Finally, really living. For the first time since Deborah passed, I feel like I have a future worth looking forward to. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let love blind you. Don't let loneliness make you reckless. And don't let anyone, no matter how charming, no matter how convincing, make you feel crazy for asking questions. You're not crazy. You're not paranoid. You're protecting yourself. And you're worth protecting. Was I right to expose Vivian the way I did? At our engagement party in front of everyone we knew? Or would you have done something different in my place? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you think. If this story hit close to home, if you're dealing with someone who might not be who they claim to be, don't stay silent. Get help. Document everything. And remember that you're not alone. Like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe to John Vengeance so you never miss when justice gets served. And tap that notification bell, because every week we bring you another story of people who refused to be victims. Stay fierce, because every story deserves its moment of sweet
Revenge.